Hey, what's up guys? I'm Mel from Fortin Amps, and in this video, I'm going to teach you guys how to get a solid clean tone out of any amp sim. Alright, so when it comes to amp sims and tone, it boils down to three fundamental things. One, your source signal, so that would be your strings and your pickups, and what pickup types you have. Two, your gain staging, and three, your plugin headroom. And what I mean by plugin headroom is the distortion or breakup done on purpose by your amp and not clipping. In this video, I'm going to go over those three fundamental things and its relationship and how it affects your clean tone in your amp. Alright, so first things first, I talked about source signal. So source signal boils down to your strings and your pickups and maybe your tone wood depending on the quality of your guitar. So when it comes down to strings, you're gonna probably want newer strings or relatively new strings that are in tune. That's because the older the strings on your guitar, the darker the tone will be and the muddier your tone will be. And the other part of your source signal is the pickup type. So active pickups, passive pickups, humbuckers, single coils or split coils, and even P90s all have a very different clean tone or direct signal coming from the guitar. Some are warmer, some are darker, and some are spankier, and some are fuller, depending on the type and placement and position on the guitar. Okay, so moving on to the second part, gain staging. If you're not able to get gain staging done correctly, your guitar will be broken up or distorted before it even touches the amp sim. And sometimes if you're generally playing in a distorted environment, most guitar players who are beginners won't notice that the guitar signal is digitally distorting before it hits the plugin. So when they switch over to a clean tone, sometimes they perceive that the plugin is creating a bad clean tone because the source signal is being clipped on the way in or distorted. And if you're looking to figure out more about clipping and distortion, I made a good video on overdrives versus boosters describing the basics of clipping. So to put it bluntly, if you're clipping on the way in because your interface is clipping your guitar signal will already be distorted and your tone and your clean tone will sound bad. It won't sound like the amp distortion you want. Sometimes it sounds really distorted, and sometimes most beginner guitarists won't notice that the guitar signal is already clipped because there's so much distortion already going on in the plugin. But that depends on the amp sim. And as I talked about earlier, plugin headroom. As some of you guys may or may not know, 90% of guitar distortion is actually just clipping. In this sense, it's analog clipping or emulated clipping in the plugin. Sometimes it's with distortions or overdrives before it hits your amp, or it's with the amp head. But in a digital sense, all of that is being emulated and recreated like the circuitry would respond to the guitar signal. But for this video, I'm going to focus on avoiding clipping so we can get a nice, lush, clean guitar signal for our clean tone. If you've properly gain staged your guitar signal, you should be able to easily plug in and get a solid clean tone with any solid guitar amp sim software. In the Neural DSP amp sims like the Nameless or the Kali or even the NTS, you can find that you can control your gain structure in many different places. First, you can do it with the input section, the gain on the amp. Sometimes there are two gain stages on the amp itself, the volume into the power amp section, and the digital output of the plugin. All of these controls will introduce different levels of digital or emulated analog saturation. The input signal, if driven too hot, will introduce digital clipping, which is undesired for clean tones. The amp gain on the amp head will introduce different levels of preamp saturation, and the amp volume will introduce an emulated amp or power amp saturation. And lastly, the digital output of the plugin can introduce digital clipping saturation or clipping if dialed in too hot. The input and the output of the plugin are both very sensitive and can introduce undesired clipping sounds or digital distortion if done incorrectly. So you're going to want to watch out for dialing these two sections too hot, because if you do, you're going to introduce a very strange or distorted sense of clipping that isn't normally desired in traditional production. Alright, so for this video, I chose to use the Fortin Nameless plugin by Neural DSP to further prove that high gain amp sims are capable of giving you a solid clean tone if you understand the concept of headroom and saturation. All right, so enough talk about this. Let's jump to dialing it in. All right, so I'm over here at my setup with my FGN Iliad with Seymour Duncan's JB and Jazz with split coils, just to show you guys what it would sound like in different pickup configurations. So just letting you guys know, I'm going to be switching between different pickup positions and splitting the coils just to give you guys a demonstration on the output levels of the guitar and how it affects signal output when dialing it in an interface. So right now I have the outputs on my interface at 12 o'clock and I have my plugin rolling just at default. So let's hear how it sounds. As you can tell, the signal's super hot. So first things first, let's actually disable the plugin and let me show you guys how to properly stage your gain within your DAW. So luckily for me, I have my interface controller over here. So let's go check that out. All right, so you'll notice that in most DAWs, if you were clipping, your DAW will tell you via a red light. And you can actually hear that unwanted saturation just in the DI tone. Right now I have the plugin disengaged, so this is just what my guitar sounds like going straight into my computer. You can tell that it starts crunching out and it has a very undesirable, like, crackle to it that isn't really something that you hear in professional production. It's buzzy and it isn't really the saturation you want when you're producing or recording a record. So I'm gonna head over to my interfaces controller and show you how I adjust the gain. So right now I'm just gonna adjust the gain until it stops clipping. So I'm gonna turn that down. I'm gonna listen for it and also look at the metering. Sometimes clipping might occur without you being cognizant of it. So it's always good to listen and look for that sound. So I'm hitting relatively hard just to give myself enough headroom. So now that I've hit the guitar as hard as I can, my DAW's telling me that it's no longer clipping. You'll also see that in the Neural DSP plugins, if you are clipping, it tells you up here and in its plugin output. So both in the input and the output of the plugin, it will tell you if you are clipping. All right, so now that I've dialed in my input signal, let's engage the plugin. As you can see, the input over here, it is no longer clipping, and on the output, it is no longer clipping. It's a nice solid default signal to come out of the Fortin Cali. If you were clipping or you were too hot, it would be indicated like so. You would see a little tick over here that your input signal would be too hot. So let's undo that, acknowledge that we clipped, and the next time it rolls around, it will remove the clipping indicator. So now that we've dialed in our input gain to our interface, let's jump into the plugin and listen to what it sounds like on default. Definitely not clean. All right, so what I'm gonna do to get me that clean tone is I'm actually going to start with lowering the input gains as much as possible. Usually when I dial in a single channel amp, in real life, I usually reach for lowering my gains and raising my amp volume to give me the maximum amount of headroom possible. So for this particular channel, I'm actually gonna go with the high input because I feel like the high input has more headroom than the low. So as you can tell, the low has a bit more crunch than the high. So I'm gonna go with the high. And like I said before, I'm gonna raise my amp volume as much as possible. So that's pretty hot, and now it's clipping. So I'm gonna lower this output volume here so it's not clipping. So I think that's sick. That's a solid starting point for what we have. Cool. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna actually check to see if I have anything affecting my clean tone. I should have done this in the beginning, but shame on me, I'm gonna do it now. I had the grind on, so that's introducing more saturation into my preamp. So I'm going to turn that off and see what it sounds like. Immediately a lot more fuller and a lot clearer. First things first, you're going to want to check if your pedal section has nothing adding saturation, and then you're going to check if, and then you're going to lower your gains and make sure you have the most amount of headroom so your amp doesn't break up your signal since you're looking for that clean tone. So right now, this is what my tone sounds like with nothing else. Solid, nice tone on the bridge. Let's split the coils to see what it sounds like. Nice, solid, clear, a little spanky, but we can address that later. And then let's go to the bridge. Nice, a bit fuller and a bit more warm. Let's see what the bridge split sounds, the neck split sounds like. Nice and spanky and a little bit warmer since it's on the neck. When I'm doing single coil tones, I like to bring the output volume back rather than pulling up the gain. Now you can see that I have a nice, solid, bright, clean tone. So, just because I feel like the Nameless is inherently a brighter amp, I'm going to dial back that treble. Probably push my mids and push the bass a bit more. I could see that I rolled, I started clipping on my output, so I'm going to roll that back. Clipping, so. So there you have it. It should be that simple to get a solid clean tone. I might roll off the tone knob on my amp just to give me a little bit more, like a little bit more warm. Sometimes those transients or the high end gets a bit more pokey than needed. I might roll that back. So I might roll that back depending on what position I'm in, but overall, it shouldn't be that crazy to get a solid clean tone out of your guitar synth. Traditionally, clean tones have a touch of room ambience, reverb, or delay. So I'm going to reach for my delay right now, and I'm going to bring in just my DAW's analog delay. And since I don't have a click, I have no idea what my delay is going to actually sound like, but if you want to add reverbs and delays, you can definitely reach for any of the Neural DSP plugins and just disable the amp section entirely, and you can go with that. I understand that the other plugins would have great clean tones, but if you only have something like Nameless or a high gain plugin outside of the Neural DSP library, you could easily get these results by just dialing back the gain, pushing your amp volume as much as you can, and then adjusting your output and input levels like so. Another thing to note is that if you're clipping on the way in, you didn't dial this in as well. Like for instance, if you had your input cranked on your interface like this, you'll notice that your plugin is actually distorted for some strange reason. You'll start hearing that sense of crunch, kind of like something is this hot. It's going to be hot. And if your plugin is too hot, you might not notice when it is in a setting like this. If you're in a distorted setting, you might not notice your plugin clip. because it's too hot coming in and it's already distorted on the way in. So just make sure you have yourself a healthy, clean signal before you hit your amp, or else you're going to get a distorted tone regardless of what settings you have in your amp sim. And it's very important too, just to note, and I might say this in other videos, that you don't set your plugin input too hot and you don't set your interface input too hot, or you're going to experience clipping before it hits the plugin. And if it's clipping before it hits the plugin's not doing the job as it was intended to do, because it needs a clean guitar signal before it hits the amp in order for it to saturate the way you want it and for you to be able to get the most control out of your plugin possible. All right, so for my in-mix demonstration, I'm going to take a few tidbits of what Eric Pastrana played in the Sigil demo in the clean sections, just to show you guys that you can get a solid clean tone out of the Nameless suite. So with that being said, let's jump into the mix section. Alright, so there you have it, guys. I hope this video gave you a better idea on how to dial in your clean tone for your amp sims and how to properly gain stage your guitar going into your interface. And if it did, hit that thumbs up button, sub to the channel if you haven't already, ring the bell for notifications to the channel, and let me know in the comment section below what challenges you're facing with your amp sim. Alright, my name is Mel from Fortin Amps, and I'll catch you on the next one.